Yes.
Jenny, are you able to spotlight the speaker?
I think so. Let me just give it a go. Does that work?
I don't know.
It looks like it's working to me. We've got two
Great.
spotlights, the slides and Kirsten.
Great. That's what we want. Thank you. No, close that door. I'll close that door.
Anton, it's 2 o'clock. Is it all right if I? Okay. Do you want to shut the door? Okay. Hello, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started since it's 2 o'clock? Please welcome, I'm welcoming you to concurrent session 2C. We are scheduled to have 2 speakers. Right now, only 1 speaker has shown up, so I'm not sure exactly how this will progress, but we'll see if the second speaker comes. I know he lives in Denver, Colorado, so I think it's about 6 a.m. there. Maybe he overslept. I don't know. But anyway, we'll have our first speaker and then take some questions, and then we'll check and see if Alan has come. But our first speaker is Kirsten Stevens-Wood. She's a senior lecturer at Cardiff Metropolitan University. She's currently working on a PhD exploring creativity and experimentality in intentional communities. She's also the lead for the Intentional Communities Research Group and an editor for Diggers and Dreamers. Her paper today is titled Intentional Communities in the UK and Their Response to an Aging Population. Kirsten.
Hello, good morning. It's very strange not seeing everybody in the room, but I feel welcome. I can hear some voices in the background, which is quite pleasant actually. So I'm just going to share my screen. Where's my little button gone? Here we go. Okay, share, go into PowerPoint, and I'm going to go full screen and switch them around. Okay, so thank you for introducing me. I'm just going to do that again, I guess, slightly. So I'm going to be talking about aging in intentional communities in this session. But before I kind of get started, I'm just going to introduce myself. So yeah, I'm based in Cardiff, which is in Wales, which is attached to England, but slightly separate. We have what's called devolved government, which means that we have different rules around things like health, education, and in some ways, actually, we have different rules around things like planning, which can impact intentional communities. as the introducer just said, I'm also the lead for the Intentional Communities Research Group, which really is a very mixed group. It's international, interdisciplinary, and it's a group of academics, PhD students, researchers, and even people who are research active who live in communities, and we meet and we discuss our research and share. It's a great group. I run a optimistically biannual Intentional Community Symposium, which might run next year if I can find the energy. And I am a member of Diggers and Dreamers Collective, which brings me much pleasure. So it's lovely to be here today. So today, I just think it was important to set some parameters for this, as I'm aware it's an international conference, and this piece of research very much is situated in the UK, where we perhaps don't have we have the history of intentional communities, but maybe not so much around things like co-housing. And I guess I also wanted to bring to the room from a very early stage the fact that I'm very much aware of things like senior co-housing, and that this piece of research doesn't cover senior co-housing because it's quite a distinct phenomenon of which we have quite limited experience of in terms of the long term in the UK. So this piece of research was drawn from the experiences of intergenerational communities. So I'm going to go on and explain a little bit about the communities that I've used for this research, but it is important to think about them as intergenerational. So they encompass, you know, families, children, and also elders within one community. And then the other thing, I guess, to underpin this is to say that these interviews, they weren't initially about aging in community. It was a fascinating piece of research that I did about 5 years ago, where I interviewed a whole series of founder members and other people about what made living communally, living in intentional community successful. And I was kind of looking at what, you know, the first 5 years setting up, and I interviewed lots and lots of founder members and other people living in current communities. But what I found in these interviews, and something that came up again and again, was that people quite often, once they'd done talking about setting up the community, they then talked about how that very early stage of setting up was playing out in terms of the long run, what was happening later down the road. And as you'll see from the table I've produced for this presentation, I interviewed communities which were kind of approaching 45 years in action, and others that were relatively new, but they all had something to say about growing older in community, about aging, and I thought that it was very interesting. So I've brought that to this presentation today. So I'm going to back up very slightly because I want to set some context around aging generally in Britain, and possibly what we might call, is it OECD countries, you know, economically developed countries. Now, Boomergeddon is not my word, but it is something that tickled me. So I hope everybody will take it in that in that the way it was meant. But when we look at the demographics for the UK, and this is being replicated in lots of economically developed countries, what we can see is individuals living longer, but they're also becoming a sort of a larger proportion of general population. And in Britain, what we can see is that without immigration, British population is starting to flatten out. There are some statistics that say by somewhere around 2025, 2030, we wouldn't be replacing ourselves. I'm not going to moan about Brexit, but it does seem like that might not be such a wise move. So, but what we're also seeing in populations who are getting older is that there are a couple of different things, which is that common chronic conditions, things that come with general kind of aging, are still afflicting our older generations at around about the same point in life as previous cohorts. But the big change is that lifestyle and medical advances mean that additional years are better quality, and also that people are less and less looking to spending time in institutional care in those earlier years. the experience of getting older in the UK is a mixed one. But what some of the research, or a lot of the research, is finding is that there is a definite shift in expectations of aging and care and later life. Something I didn't mention is that I'm situated at Cardiff Metropolitan, and one of the courses I teach on is health and social care. So we're watching this happen in real time with students who are working in the sector, and there is a changing expectation about what people want and where they're going in their later life. We're finding that older people, and again, this is not a universal phenomenon, but generally are more wealthy. They hold more wealth. It might be in property or in pensions, but they're also more educated than previous cohorts. And that this extension of quality of life years means that those sort of traditional life pathways are changing, and the expectations of the individuals are changing alongside that. As I said, we do know that the aging is an unequal experience, and even in a country as small as the UK, we know that people living in the wealthiest areas have twice as many years of disability-free life ahead of them at age 65 than in the poorest areas. I think you can even find this in Wales. I seem to remember that there's something like an 8-year gap between one part of Rhondda Taff, and then you move only about 40 miles east, so into the more affluent area of Monmouthshire, and suddenly you're looking at a completely different demographic. I thought it would be quite interesting, just quickly as well, to talk about the way that a particular demographic is experiencing aging. Higgs and Jones wrote a really interesting paragraph here. I'm just going to read it. They said, "We're witnessing an aging of generations who have taken a particular approach to adult life, which has been organized through the prism of a youth-orientated consumer culture. The post-war baby bulge cohorts who grew up in circumstances of expanding consumer choice and economic prosperity created a generational schism between themselves and those older than them who had grown up in less prosperous times. This schism manifested itself in attitudes, music, clothes, but most significantly in lifestyle, where there have been accumulative changes to the nature of families, relationships, and sexuality. An important part of this generational habitus is that the teenagers of the 60s have become the retirees of the 21st century." And I just think that it's fascinating that, you know, in the UK particularly, we have a really kind of big movement of intentional communities that formed at the tail end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. And these will have been this group kind of going into their early adulthood. And we're now watching them go into their later adulthood. And some scholars suggest that we now have a growing phenomenon of something called the third age. You probably have heard of things like the University of the Third Age, and this is people kind of 50 to 70. Family responsibilities are receding, and they're starting to have this kind of this life of freedom. But there's also there's some evidence that suggests that individuals often see aging as something that isn't personal, it doesn't happen to them. And actually the piece of research I used for this presentation, they interviewed people in their 70s, 80s and 90s, and all of them kind of went, well, you know, I'm 80, but they're old, you know, I'm kind of hanging on and not getting old. And I thought that was really interesting, because what we very rarely encounter within the sort of discourses of aging is this idea of this fourth age. So Ball describes the third age as this time of a good life, family, friends, voluntary work, learning, personal development. So the third age is encompassed in the discourse as an incredibly positive and productive period, whereas the fourth age is often described as this process of a transition from autonomy and independence into a period of greater acceptance of things like physical fragility, mental decline, and dependence. And I wanted to visit this particular phenomenon in the context of intentional communities, because I've also done some other research that tells me that people who live and grow older in intentional communities tend to experience very good health. But that there are sticky points in that. And critical gerontologists suggest that we enter this latter period and there's this process of kind of othering. It's not going to happen to me. Getting old is something that happens to other people, not a non-consideration of that very late part of life. So we look to the literature and ask that question, well, is living communally a solution? Does this provide the answers to some of these issues? And actually the picture is incredibly positive. We can see that there is research that shows that it reduces feelings of loneliness, increases quality of life. It has the potential to kind of eco-villages or the feel of a community. It could be cost effective and ecologically better for us. And we can create meaningful relationships within community. So all good. So I'm going back to a data set. As I said, I collected I interviewed people about founder members and setting up communities. And in fact, I wrote about it in one of the Diggers and Dreamers directories most recently. But within that data, people wanted to talk about how it was playing out later on, how it was playing out years later sometimes. So I'm going to be including some of the quotes I've taken from these 5 different communities, all established at different times. So the oldest one established in the 1970s, one 80s, one in the 90s, no, 2 in the 90s, and 1 in the 2000s. Relatively large, mixed, intergenerational communities, all of which had members over 65. Most of them had land, they had things to manage, and that will kind of show when we go into the data for this. So what were people saying? Well, there were lots of really positive things, but there were a few things that kind of stuck out for me in terms of themes that rose up out of the discussions that I was having. And one of them was this idea about talking about aging. Now, I suppose it's good to remember that this research is not senior co-housing. It wasn't set up for older people, and therefore we wouldn't necessarily have expected those people to have had those conversations. But some people described it as this elephant in the room. So I'm gonna talk through these quotes and take us through this. So this is a female in her 60s in community A. So if we look back to that table, this is a community that was formed in the 1970s. And she says, well, we're an aging community, but no one wants to talk about it. I tried to put it on the agenda over 15 years ago, but it's become something we don't seem to be able to discuss. And then this is community B, a female in her 70s. And actually, I was very lucky to have caught this person because they were actually looking to move. They were looking to move because she was losing mobility, and the premises, the building that they were inhabiting just wasn't set up to allow for reduced mobility. And she says the buildings are not designed for the needs of older people. Something we hadn't even considered when we moved in. You think you will be young forever, that old age is something that happens to other people. And it was amazing because this woman from community B, she talked about buying the property that they moved into, and she was in her early 30s. They'd stripped roofs, they'd gone up scaffolding, they'd done some fairly phenomenal stuff. But the one thing that they hadn't done is they hadn't considered what would happen 40, 50 years down the road when their needs changed and when they needed something else in order to accommodate their lives. And then the last one here is a female in community C, and she says, well, it's difficult. We've seen, and she names her friend, her co-member in their house, in their community. She says, we've witnessed her decline because we see her every day. But when do you intervene? She's always been incredibly independent, and I don't know how she would feel if we started intervening. And she talked about how there was no mechanism for opening that conversation up or for having a discussion about what the boundaries of care were. It wasn't that people didn't want to care, it was the fact that they didn't know what the boundary was. So this is the first one. The second one of this was this idea of time served and building social credit, which I actually find really interesting. And maybe there's some solutions we can learn from other communities. But in these particular contexts, we had someone from, again, Community A, which is the longest community that I interviewed in this series. And she says, well, it's tricky with, and she names an older member of their community. She's been here for years. She was a founder member. And so now it feels like she's entitled to grow old, and it is right that we should support her. So in this particular instance, the community was supporting this individual. They were allowing for this individual to grow old. They were holding her aging process within the community. However, it was all informal. There was no formalized way of managing that. And in fact, I remember asking in the same conversation about, well, how would you feel if someone in their 80s or 90s applied to join your community? And she said, well, that would be very difficult. That would be very difficult. And she said, you know, with this person, she's served 40 years. I'm not sure how we would manage someone who came in with high needs without the ability to contribute. And then this one here is Community D, so a newer community, you know, maybe a 30-year community. And this is a younger male. He says, well, he's talking about a community member who had actually died. He says, well, he gave everything to this community. So much energy. He was there from the start, and when it was so much harder to live here. In the last couple of years, he went from being a very active, energetic member to coming up and making tea. And everyone was good with that because of his history. So there was this embedded idea that people who had served time or built up social credit somehow were enabled within the community to remain there without being under pressure to contribute. Again, this wasn't a formalized thing. And again, I asked the very same question, you know, how would that work? And this particular interviewee said, well, it wouldn't. You know, there was no question. They said, you know, we have to make things work here. And that leads really neatly onto the last one of the sort of three categories that I'm looking at today, which is the viability of the community. So not only were all of these communities that I interviewed intergenerational, but most of them were very practical communities. They had pieces of land, quite a lot of them did a lot of growing. They had property to manage. They had, you know, stuff they did. Some of them had small businesses, others didn't, you know, but people had to make their living. They had to pay the bills. They had to have an income. And lots of people wanted to talk about the viability of the community. And as I said at the very beginning of all of this, I was very much interested in the founding of communities, the setting up. But actually what people wanted to talk about was the viability of the community. Where was it going? How were they going to manage these processes? How could they manage these in a way that was balancing the needs of the community itself as a whole against the needs of individuals who perhaps had higher levels of needs at different stages of their lives? So male here against Community A, so we've looked at this a couple of times from different perspectives, and he says, well, we're a working community. It only works if we have most or ideally all of the community pulling their weight. I know it's not a very PC thing to say, but we can't afford to have more than one or two people who are not contributing to the work. And even then it creates pressure. So it's this idea of, you know, kind of almost pressing against the previous slide where people were happy to support given individuals who created social capital, who'd contributed over years. It was saying, well, actually, you know what, we can only do that so far. And then the second male here, community D, said, well, this isn't an easy place to live unless you're pretty fit and able-bodied. We don't have the infrastructure to support people who can't self-care or contribute. It sounds harsh, but it's the reality of living. I think I've missed here off the end there. And then the last one was a little brutal, but he says, can I be honest? People join communities like this expecting them to be this cocoon of care and support, and then they're disappointed. Yes, we look after each other, but the bigger stuff, dementia, disability, is it realistic to expect these kinds of things? So I don't have the answers to this, but I have had extensive amounts of conversations around this subject. And in fact, I've just last weekend, a wonderful communities conference in a place called Braziers Park in just outside Oxford. And I met lots and lots of people who were quite interested in these ideas of aging in community. And something that came up, which was in my original slide, but something I managed to discuss, was this idea of rituals and structures to deal with frailty, death and dying. And there was a really fascinating conversation I had with a couple from the Bruderhof community who talked about the way in which they care for their elders all the way through, and that they have their own burial grounds, they have their own ceremonies, they have their own structures, and that all of that is embedded in their community structures. And I was thinking, actually, some of that could be something that we could transpose and learn into some of our intergenerational communities. I also thought it was very interesting, something that to pull out of the interviews that I had, was this idea of having those conversations around dependency and boundaries of care. I was reading something, I think it was Melissa Gregoita, she'll have to forgive me for saying that wrong. And they talk about sticky boundaries, about how it's better to have clarity on what a community can and can't provide when looking at whether or not a community can provide care. And also the rules of exchange. What are the rules of exchange? How can we create the rules of exchange so that they are fair? There's lots of talk at the moment about something called intergenerational justice, this idea of people taking and giving fairly between generations, and how can we replicate this within intentional communities? And just as a last point, I think it's also about whether or not we should be opening up more conversations about exchange and including possibly money or equity. And I think this is a very British thing, because strangely enough, I attended an FIC session about a month ago, which was all about elders, and Americans appear to be much better at talking about these things quite explicitly. You know, should someone be donating their equity to the community in exchange for care? Should there be a financial exchange? Should we be paying people within the community in order for them to be able to live within the community, and that's their job? How do we manage these exchanges so that they benefit both the people who live in the communities and the older people who live in communities, without creating a hierarchy or a structure that becomes, you know, unhealthy or unspoken? And that's my time. I don't know how I'm doing for time.
Perfect time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Has Alan shown? Oh, yeah. Let's clap for Kirsten. Thank you. Thank you very much. Has Alan shown up? Anton? No?
Not
Okay.
online.
All right. So let's open the floor for questions. But first, I want to find out, do we have any Zoom participants, or do we just have in-person participants?
We have several people on Zoom, and we've already got one hand up.
Okay, good. So we'll start with a question in the room, and then I'll move to you, Jenny, for the next question, okay? All right, questions. Oh, what's wrong? I don't understand. Okay. Questions? Yes.
Hi. Is it on okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, my name's Eldad, and thanks for the very interesting talk. And my wife and I are here, and we're from the Bruderhof. So you mentioned us as a community that's been existing for 100 years, actually, and in England, and having people who were born in the community and are in their 80s. So we obviously are very familiar with this topic. And on the one hand, I can say that we're very happy to be able to say that we do have the buildings and the care and the commitment to look after our elderly people and to appreciate their contribution and to give them opportunities to work in our workshop, even if they're in their 90s, and to have care for disability and dementia and things like that. So we're very happy about that, but it's still something that we grapple with. And one thing that I don't know if you came across in your research that you might want to comment on is the connection between younger people and the elderly in terms of the way they think about the world and the way they think about things, and the potential for a different worldview, a different view of society that can potentially cause misunderstandings between the younger and the elderly, which is something that we deal with. I believe that we do try to overcome this, but it's something that I wondered if you want to comment on.
Thank you. I'm really glad you're in the room, actually. It was a wonderful conversation we had with the Darvel community last weekend, and they shared lots of information about their community, which was great. With regards to intergenerational communication and understanding, I don't have any of my own research on this. I have anecdotal. I mean, I'm a lecturer, so I'm embedded with hundreds of 18-year-olds, 18 to 21-year-olds every year, and I do know that there is talk around things like intergenerational justice, this idea that older people are hoovering up resources and young people are not having them, but it's more of a, but I don't know whether that's the question that you're asking. I wonder if you're asking more about kind of understandings of the world and how we make sense of the world that we're living in. Can I just ask whether that is where you were going with this?
Yes, I don't think it's a question of justice. I think our younger people are very happy to accept that the elderly are fully entitled to all the care they get. I mean, I think it does help, by the way, that there is this life commitment in our communities, that it's taken for granted and that everybody will be part of the community until they die. So it's not even a question. But it's just that whether you're talking about society or music or politics or clothing or any of these other topics, there is this view that's different and potentially a disconnect, and that's, I'm just interested in that.
I suspect that that's a universal phenomenon rather than a community's phenomenon. You know, the every generation will have its own thing, and I'm afraid I don't have any research to show that. Something I found really interesting, though, again from my conversations with Darvel, I believe you fund your students through things like university and higher education. I can see you don't need to. I understand you fund your young people through their education.
Right.
And I think that probably helps with the feeling of inclusion, you know, in terms of supporting everybody if that support is wholly felt within the community, that young people are being supported in terms of their development and their education and having that funded, and older people are being seen through in terms of their care to the end. That may be that creates a better feeling of unity within a community.
Yeah, it's true that we do try to support our young people through education, although not always and universally. It's not like everybody can do anything they want and the community will pay for it, but there is definitely some effort that goes into that. I will also say on a positive note that the experience from many of our young people in caring for the elderly has actually been a very positive thing, even for somebody with dementia or very limited ability. Often they will speak very highly of the experience of being with that person. And conversely, the struggle of the elderly to accept that help. And we often have to tell this old person that you're doing a favor for this young person by allowing them to push your wheelchair. And they would much rather have an electric wheelchair and zoom around by themselves and crash into things. So it's an interesting dynamic there.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the Zoom world now. And Jenny, do you want to get the
Yes.
next question?
We have a question from Elizabeth or Libby. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciated it. I'm coming out of the Camp Hill context. So disability and aging is connected to that is somehow, yeah, it has a different relationship, but also a lot of the same questions. But I want to ask about something else. In your slide that you had around the viability of the community, I was immediately struck by the fact that all three of the quotes you pulled to highlight that were from male participants. And now I might, think that, oh, well, it's just a fluke, it's the quotes that are most evocative. But given just how extremely gendered care work is, it was kind of hard to not think maybe there's something deeper here in this, not taking for granted the fact that care would be provided throughout the lifespan. So I just wonder, were there sort of gendered, divides across some of these questions and the more prevalent attitudes that you were finding? Or was it more even across the board and that was, just a fluke?
That's a great question, Libby. And actually, when I was putting these slides together, it did not go beyond my notice that all three of the quotes on that particular slide were male. And I did go back and re-listen to my recordings to see if there was a way of balancing it out, and there wasn't. And 12 interviews don't constitute a fair sample. But I would say that I've been trying to write this up as a paper, and there is a lot of interesting debates to be had around how we value people and those transactions, and that sometimes when we reduce all of our transactions down to what you can get out of something, or how, when we move away from gifting and love and care and we move into how is this being paid for, whether that's through labor or time, or then we reduce it to a transaction. And I think sometimes we fall into those traps of thinking of things transactionally instead of thinking about things in that kind of much longer whole systems approach. I haven't done much work with Camp Hill. I visited. I once thought of defecting. there's one in Wales, but I don't know enough about how that works. But I do know that a lot of communities really, really struggle with, especially the ones that are perhaps trying to lean towards things like self-sufficiency. they really struggle with that kind of, we've got to make enough money to pay the bills and kind of interact with the world, you know, because they don't get free electricity, they don't give free gas and electric to people because they're nice. And to balance that kind of quite brutal economic situation against trying to provide care and that sort of softer side of us as human beings within the community context. And sometimes those two things do bump up against each other. But yeah, it was mostly male. Whether that's a fair thing to kind of say, well, that's how it is, I couldn't say just from this small sample. But yeah, it was noticeable in this thing, yeah.
Okay, we have a question from the room.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It's not a question, it's just a comment that I will be lecturing on Saturday about inclusion versus exclusion of the oldest old in a changing communal kibbutz. So some of the issues that you raises about age, about feeling age, about wanting to get help from others, and how community on the one side assist all the people to be part of the kibbutz and feel equal, and on the other side they feel very liminal. They feel that the society pushes them outside. So it's like both feelings, and I was investigating those people until their death, and we can see the changes of feeling involved versus excluding, approaching death. And actually, when they're very old, they don't really care about being involved or not. They're feeling much more individualized, and you know, they're doing what they want, and they less care about society. But this is about the oldest old. Not necessarily about oldest old in those communities. It's about feeling oldest.
Thank you.
Jenny, do we have a question from Zoom?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay, question in the room. Anybody? Yes. Let's see if this reaches to you.
Hello, my name is Betsy Morris. I'm from the US, so more familiar with issues there. And I didn't hear your full presentation, so my questions are a little bit leading. One is that I've been exposed to something called the Progressive Aging Network. And they have held quite a few conferences before COVID, so I'm sure they're doing something now. And it's rooted, there's a piece of it that's out of the Fielding Graduate Institute in California, which has alternative degree programs, including in gerontology and aging. So the Progressive Aging Network or movement included research from some very interesting people, inspired in part by Dr. Bill Thompson, I think his name is, creator of what he was calling, I think it's the tree house or the greenhouse method of creating households of where, and they vary in different ways, but essentially people who need help and would like to live in a cooperative household have rooms, and they determine it's like assisted living, but or skilled nursing at some points, but they determine like when meals are and what foods will be served in their community kitchen. I'm wondering, and I've heard other incredible experiments or observational experiments. So I wonder if you're aware of that or might be interested in some of that work. And then, so not community-based, but efforts at intergenerational communications. Like what were the songs that motivated your decade of growing up, and then the current decade, you know, can speak what do the songs mean to them? So there's just been a lot of a very small strand of what we would call positive aging movement. Maybe you could, yeah. Are there any influences in the UK or any prospects for that you see? Thanks.
I think just thank you. I've just written that down. Actually, I'll have a look at that later. So that's really interesting. I think, I mean, obviously this is a really short presentation, so everything gets squeezed into, just a few slides. But that discussion about third age versus fourth age, I find quite fascinating that well, first of all, I see the phrase successful aging bandied about quite often in the literature. And when we talk about successful aging, we also, there's always an underside to things. So then, are we talking about unsuccessful aging? Are we failing at aging by the inevitable, which is dying and frailty? And I think the other thing again is that we, especially in the UK, and I would imagine it's very similar in the US, we sanitize end of life. It becomes medicalized and sanitized. And I guess I'm drawing from my health and social care strand of my work here, in that we have become separated off from the end of life processes, and therefore we don't necessarily have the mechanisms to cope with them, which is why I found the discussions with Bruderhof people in the last community that I spoke to really, really interesting, because they do have some of those mechanisms. They might not be right, they may have their own issues with what goes on, but actually they have some of those processes in place, and we seem to have separated ourselves off from that. And I think, what does it mean to age successfully? Because I'm sure it doesn't mean being able to do yoga every day. Maybe, we need to reframe some of these things, and think about how we can facilitate them right the way to the end. I mean, the other thing I noticed, and of course I've been doing a lot of reading in the week up to this, because I'm, read. And there is the emergence of senior co-housing in the UK, but I'm very much aware that that's not a new phenomenon in lots of other places, that senior co-housing has been happening for some time. But I'm also aware that there's a certain amount of information that basically says, and then she left. And it, or we all held hands and cried before she went off to wherever she went. And it's almost like the story finishes before the human being finishes. And I found that really quite interesting, that we talk about lifetime homes and we talk about aging in place, but all of those would mean that we were actually spending our lifetimes there, that we were being seen through to the end, as opposed to being seen through to the end of successful aging. They're just some thoughts, really. I wasn't expecting to talk this long.
Jenny, a question in Zoom? Oh, Marcus has a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Can you
good.
hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsten. Fascinating topic. In one way, I feel like a newbie around some of the issues that are being raised, but there's always one of them at every conference, and I guess this time I'm the one. But I'm curious. I'm curious about if there's any link between the purpose of an intentional community or a community or its foundational myth and the type of attention or that is being given to aging and caring. So in other words, depending on the why, in other words, a community comes together, are there any differences there, or have you been able to name? And I'll just say a comment, and I'm looking forward to your answer. When I was listening and viewing what it is that you were sharing with us, I was sort of, there appears, I'll say that because I really don't know, there appears to be communities centered around doing something, where the being is not as obvious in the comments that you shared, and I am aware of what you said in terms of numbers, but let's take the numbers that they're great numbers. They're stories, right? So they're important. I'm working, and I'll be speaking at the next group, but I'm working researching with L'Arche, and a community that is much more centered around being. So this whole notion of not caring for somebody because he or she is aging would not even be a topic. And even the funerals are celebrated, and they want to spend last minutes with them, and all the caring that has gone on. So when I was listening to what it is that you were saying, I said, knowing that there's a variety of communities, but I was really listening from the doing and the being, and then sort of thinking that the doing communities, that when you're useless, if I use it in that, when I can no longer contribute, well, I should be put aside, and somebody else should come in that can replace my body. So anyway, it could be, I may be generalizing here, but that's sort of what I was picking up from what you said.
Thank you, Marcus. This is a really valid question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, two things I'm just trying to write down. You made lots of points, but I guess two things is that you're absolutely right. Most of the communities included in my samples were set up initially because they were very dewy communities. You know, they wanted to work the land, or they wanted to be self-sufficient, or they wanted to, you know, they had a kind of a goal. And I guess, you know, all of that, all of the, not necessarily even academic literature, but a lot of the literature says that it's really critical for a community to have a common goal, or to have you know, to have something that draws everyone together. And for quite a lot of those types of communities, it tends to be land or the environment or a project type of coming together. And I guess that does change the nature. You're absolutely right. It changes the nature of how they might mature and develop over time. And I am aware of L'Arche, and I guess for me, there's communities that grow and are developed by the people who inhabit them. So they are created, built, produced, and then inhabited by the individuals who create them. And then you have other organizations like L'Arche and Camp Hill, actually, who are perhaps have an overarching ideology, you know, like a sort of a driving force, and that those communities are there to create care environments and to create environments which are supportive of human beings. So that is their project in a way, you know, at least that's how I guess I would see it, is that, you know, that is the project, is that. And therefore it changes the nature of the way in which those human transactions are treated according to what the project is deemed to be. I mean, I'm thinking on my feet as much as anything else here, but yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting question. Thank you. I don't know if I answered that one okay. Feel free to come back.
I think we ought to start winding things up here, but I'd like to read one comment from the chat and then ask if there's one last question in the room. And Libby wrote in the chat, in the same vein as Marcus's comment, just a comment, Benjamin Wall has done a good amount of research on L'Arche and describes how communities can navigate the limits of their capacity to include people with high support needs of whatever stripe. He sums it up as exclusion is sometimes necessary, abandonment is never an option. This is very different attitude than what you described as the story ending before the person's life ends. There is a really fascinating parallel there, and that not being able to provide care doesn't necessarily mean that the community's responsibility doesn't end when a person leaves to access the care they need. Do we have a final question from the audience? Yes, Cheryl, just a second, a comment from Cheryl.
I was just thinking about how you had talked about these great disparities you saw in aging outcomes based on wealth. And I guess this is more of a comment, I guess, rather than a question, but it makes me wonder if that's the case in Britain with a nationalized health system, what are the possibilities in North America, or particularly in the United States, where we don't have that? And how do we address that in communities?
Oh my gosh, Cheryl. That's a wonderful question. I'm not sure I'm able to support. I mean, you're absolutely right. We do have a national health service here, which is wonderful and magical and rescues us and peels us off roads when we get run over and stops us being overly stressed about having illnesses. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't address those kind of those deep socioeconomic inequalities, which are still very much present in our society, and they go through, you know, housing, education, social capital, the things we have access to, work, leisure, and all of those things, you know. So health, I would guess, with my health and social care hat on, you know, health is an important and essential element. However, socioeconomically, I'm sure that you're all very much aware that in the UK we are going through a fairly turbulent political time at the moment, which appears to be deepening those economic and social divides. So no, I don't have any answers at the moment, other than to try to persuade my mother not to vote for the Conservatives ever again.
Well, on that note, Kirsten, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. Let's give Kirsten a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry our second speaker has not shown up, so you have a little bit of free time now. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.